From beach towels to tea towels, and from mugs to water bottles, the TNT Shop has it all. Browse our shop now at tntradio.live. You're with Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, everybody, we're into the second hour of the broadcast today. Thank you, everybody, for rejoining us on the live stream here, broadcasting globally around the world at TNT. Today's News Talk. Thank you, Mr. Basil Valentine, in the previous hour for a great segment and a lot of important stuff to discuss. I think we had a really deep discussion, especially on U.S. affairs. And by the way, all of this stuff politically reverberates globally, so you're not safe. The wave of tyranny is making its way around the planet at the moment. You're not going to be safe from it if you think you're just going to be able to hide under a rock. It's happening everywhere. But we're going to go now to the international arena. And we're going to discuss what I think there's a number of disturbing developments with the Ukraine situation. It's hard to know where to start, but to help us on this, to have this discussion, hopefully in an informed and sober way, which is what you're not getting right now with mainstream media or with our political heads in our governments. If you're in NATO stan, the UK or the US or anywhere else, you're going to have a problem getting a really good, straight, honest take on anything. So to help us on this side, we're going to be joined right now by the former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. His name is Peter Ford. He's been on the show previously and have not spoken to him for too long. Peter, it's great to have you back.
Thank you very much, Patrick, and I'll try to live up to that epithet of being sober. I think I'm sober right now.
Yeah, well, I can't say the same, Peter, for our political representatives who seem drunk on war and have been for a long time. When is this going to end? Because we're starting to see this has real consequences. This thing we've all been dragged into by force, that I think is a war. They're saying it's Putin's war of choice. I think it's their war of choice as well in the U.S., UK specifically. But what are your feelings on this right now?
Well, optimally, where it might be headed is towards a frozen conflict. Think North and South Korea. The world came close to the nuclear precipice back there in the early 50s and ended up along the demarcation line, which is still there today. But I say optimally because things could easily get a lot worse, mainly because of miscalculation on the Western side. From the get-go, we have underestimated Russia, miscalculated how Russia was going to react to being encircled, and we continue to tell lies to ourselves. One that particularly sticks in my craw is how the British intelligence services are being complimented for having correctly predicted that Russia was going to march into Ukraine on about the timescale that it did. Well, this is like marking your own homework, because it was us that more or less precipitated Russia into taking this drastic step, because we refused all olive branches that were offered. We arranged effectively for this to happen. Therefore, to say that we were clever to predict that it was going to happen is ridiculous. But it's just typical of the complacency, hubris, the lies that we tell ourselves. And then we tell ourselves that Russia, we're going to make the ruble rubble. Well, the so-called rubble is now at a 5-year high, while the British pound is plummeting practically by the hour. But we continue to tell ourselves these lies. That's why I'm a little bit pessimistic that my optimal scenario will not come about.
Yeah, and so who's most to blame by this, Peter? I mean, who's really exacerbating the problems? Is that I don't think those lies that you're just talking about there, are not being held to account. Normally the press or the media, that's their job, is to try to at least keep them honest and straight so they're not too far out of bounds, right? And none of that's happening. There's no, there's no moderate or regulating force coming from the press or the media on this. They're basically just repeating and, in fact, helping to disseminate some of these things that are just patently false, or these delusions that who's winning and who's losing.
What's really preoccupying is that I'm not even sure that it's the United States which is leading the dance now. It was the United States that led us up to the edge of this precipice by advancing the frontiers of NATO. But now it looks more like the tail is wagging the dog, and that Ukraine is leading the dance. Witness the attack on the Kerch Bridge. I'm not sure that was cleared with the Pentagon. I reckon the Ukrainians did it deliberately in order to provoke the Russians, who have been keeping the gloves on until now in terms of avoiding civilian casualties. And the Ukrainians did it precisely with the aim in view of provoking the Russians into intemperate attacks on civilian infrastructure, and thereby bringing the Western media even more in on their side, if that were possible, and bringing about precisely the deliveries of new weaponry, particularly air defense weaponry, which have been announced just in the last 48 hours. So it's very worrying that the West appears to be letting itself be led by the nose by Ukraine. And it's all very reminiscent of the way the US allows itself to be led by the nose by Israel, but that's another story.
That's interesting that you say this, Peter, because I would argue that Ukraine, from a military point of view, politically and on the ground, is losing badly and have been for the last 8 months. So it's probably in their interest, isn't it, to up the ante, as it were, between Europe or NATO and Russia. That might somehow, do they believe that's going to save them or pull NATO directly into it? Is there an advantage for Kiev there? This
must surely be Kiev's calculation. They can only win the battle or even attempt to recover their lost territories if they bring the West, particularly Europe and the States, in on their side. This must be their calculation, and therefore their every act is calculated to create the impression that they're winning. Witness the territorial gains that they've been making, regardless of the overall strategic situation. They're making it look like backing Ukraine could be a winner, because support in Europe was beginning to flag when it appeared that Ukrainian military defeat was a foregone conclusion. But things have now been turned around in terms of public perceptions by a media onslaught. The Ukrainians, have to hand it to them. They know our media better than we know it ourselves. And they, just as some years ago, the Syrian opposition followed the same strategy. Get the Western media on your side and everything else will follow.
Yeah, well, the media's going to be a big part of their calculus. Certainly, they definitely know how to wag the dog, as you said, becoming very adept at it. There's a couple of so-called massacres or things that have just kind of manifested after Russia pulls out of one area or the other, and that seems to also keep the kind of media train going at a good enough pace anyway to get what they need in terms of treasure, cash, and weapons from the West. But we'll talk more about that. We're joined right now by Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're discussing Ukraine and also NATO, and on the other side, we'll get into the NATO conversation of the latest from Brussels. I'm Patrick Henningsen, your host. This is TNT, today's News Talk. We'll be right back.
Michael Parker on TNT Radio.
Uncle Joe has been out there, trying to get OPEC to give us more oil. Well, you know what? They're no dummies. They're not going to do that. And they have agreed that they are going to cut supply to get the oil price back up, perhaps as high as $120 a barrel. The key ministers of OPEC have agreed on production cuts of up to 2 million barrels per day for oil-producing nations. Now, what's interesting about that is initially it was going to be a 500,000 or maybe 1 million barrels. So this is new news. Not only are they going to cut, but they're going to do twice as much as we thought they were going to. So at a reduction, just to put this in context, a reduction of 2 million barrels per day would mark the biggest production cut since the pandemic lockdown started. This is the equivalent of about 2% of global oil demand.
Deprogram with Michael Parker on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Google and Facebook, they don't sell you anything. They sell you.
Facebook constantly manipulates their users. They do it by the things that they insert into the news feeds, and they do it by the types of posts they allow their users to see.
It's what Google and Facebook are doing on a regular basis by suppressing stories, by steering us towards other stories rather than the stories we're actually seeking. That's the real manipulation that's going on.
I was a design ethicist at Google, where I studied how do you ethically steer people's thoughts.
It will always favor one online music service over another and one candidate over another. Google and Facebook has the power to undermine democracy without us knowing that democracy has been undermined.
It's what I call the creepy line, and the Google policy about a lot of these things is to get right up to the creepy line but not cross it.
Google crosses the creepy line every day.
Discover how society is manipulated by Google and Facebook. The Creepy Line at salemnow.com.
In 2018, 2.9 million people died of the flu and pneumonia. In 2020, there was a 98% decline in influenza, but 2.8 million die of COVID. Data never lies. We mandate that the truth be told. TNT Radio.
All right. Welcome back. We're into the second hour of this live broadcast, and we're joined by a very special guest, Peter Ford. He is the former ambassador from Britain to Syria and Bahrain. And Peter's also been, of course, following this conflict, following it very closely from the beginning and even well before that. We have him on the line right now. And Peter, you're talking about this permanent state of war. You're talking about this frozen conflict. And just as you say that, NATO has now hinted just yesterday that they are launching a 10-year plan for Ukraine, saying to rebuild its defense industry, arm it up, and so forth. Now, I'm looking at the dailies. Admittedly, I'm looking at the Russian reports, okay, and on Russian Telegram, and have been looking at it more or less every day for the last 7-8 months. And the casualties that they're taking on the Ukrainian side are immense. And it's a lot of people, there's been admissions of this here and there. We're talking about well over, 150,000 wounded, well over that. And potentially we're talking about, and some people say this is conservative, Peter, between 40 and 50,000 dead soldiers and conscripts. Okay. And now, if that's the case, if that was the case, and many people believe that it is, some say it's even worse, okay? Even if NATO provides the latest weaponry, and there seems to be this talking point, you've seen it, we need to get the latest technology into the hands of the Ukrainians so they can push back the Russians and mount a defense, a brave defense, etc. If you don't have any soldiers left to fight, Peter, then what? Mercenaries, foreign troops? I mean, how can they have a 10-year plan, or are they just completely detached from reality and they're just pushing product here, defense product? What's your assessment of this?
Well, I think everything at the moment is propaganda. Everything that gets announced goes through the propaganda filter. It may or may not be based in reality. It sounds to me just like the West is signaling that they're in this for the long haul. They're prepared to wait out Russia, and even if it does turn into a prolonged conflict, the Western resolve, as they call it, will not flag. That's the significance of talking about 10-year plan. It's probably a mythical plan, but it serves its propaganda and signaling purpose for the moment. Now, it's very difficult to know what to believe on both sides, to be honest. Everybody lies in a conflict. We have to accept that and form our judgment on the basis of probability. So yes, it is probable that Ukraine has been taking far heavier casualties than we're allowed to know about. But Ukraine does have deep demographic pockets. They have a large population, and they're indoctrinating their people to believe that it's a life and death struggle. So they may well be able to muster sufficient forces for the foreseeable future. I think that would be the only wise and prudent calculation to make. And this is why I do think that the likeliest outcome is going to be a prolonged stalemate. Who knows? Maybe there'll be a winter offensive from the side of the Russians, who have even deeper demographic pockets to dip into, as previous invaders of Russian territory going back to Napoleon's time have had cause to find out. And if it comes to a battle of demographics, there can be only one winner in the long term. But let's hope it doesn't come to that. But there's a wider picture as well. There's a worldwide struggle for influence going on here. It's not just about Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine is the least of it. What's going on is the formation, effectively, of two new blocks, the Anglosphere on one side and the global south on the other. Now, we've had an example of this just this past week with Biden announcing that he's going to get tough with Saudi Arabia. This is an example of the collateral damage. When titans fight, a lot of furniture gets moved around, and not always in a predictable way. Who'd have thought that one of the outcomes of the Ukraine conflict would be Saudi Arabia very visibly distancing itself from its former U.S. protector. And now the U.S. talking about effectively reprisals against Saudi Arabia. And then we have just today, I believe, is it Tashkent, a meeting between Putin and Turkish President Erdogan. We've seen Turkey, a NATO member, inching closer to Russia in the course of this conflict, and possibly positioning itself as a mediator. We've also seen some helpful outcome from Turkey in the midst of all this, in the shape of an incipient rapprochement with Damascus. So like I say, when the titans fight, a lot of furniture gets knocked down and moved around. And so we're seeing the emergence of a new global south, which is led effectively by China and Russia, seconded by the big big powers of the South, including Turkey and Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Brazil, with some interested onlookers in the shape of Southern Europe, Greece. Greece is semi-detached from the Anglosphere. And the Anglosphere itself is a new invention. Nobody was talking about Anglosphere until Brexit. And the UK distanced itself from the EU, with the result that the EU is now having to tag along behind the core Anglosphere of Washington, London, Ottawa, and Sydney. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a new form of polarization worldwide. It's not just about Ukraine.
Yeah. So the new world order that you're looking at is a reordering, as it were. It's putting the EU politically and economically and militarily under the wing of the Anglosphere, or the Five Eyes fraternal umbrella, as it were. It's interesting who abstained from this UN vote, Peter. Basically, is about territorial integrity of Ukraine. China and India, they abstained. There's half the world's population right there. South Africa's out. Pakistan's not participating. Thailand, Cuba, Vietnam, Armenia, Algeria, and a few no votes, obviously from Syria, Belarus, and some of the other ones there. South Sudan, funny enough, abstained, if you can imagine that. So that global South you're talking about, the media is starting to pick up on this, Peter. You're starting to see frantic headlines. Putin and Xi's bet on the global South. Wall Street Journal, same here. China and Russia's lies are winning over the global South. Bloomberg, how Russia is trying to win over the global South. The Economist, they're all basically crowing, Peter, now about the global South. Peter, I've never heard this term used in Western mainstream media before. Until now. What's going on?
Well, it's turning out that the lies that we've been telling ourselves for 6 months are now transparently untrue. And as we kept claiming, the international community turns out to be just ourselves. And most of the world, measured by population and number of countries, is actually not on our side. And yet, in some quarters, the media continue to talk about Russia being an international pariah and the international community this, international community that. But the truth is beginning to seep out in the slightly more informed circles of Western media, like Bloomberg.
Yeah, and also Politico. There's a panic that's ensuing, Peter, here. I think the Anglo-American establishment and the mainstream corporate media establishment, they're starting to recognize that there's a problem here, that the power and influence and the monopoly over thought of geopolitical ideas, this is now waning. It's being distributed over different areas now. So they don't have absolute control over how things are framed. And talking about a global political discussion, normally at the UN, when the UN ambassador speaks, or the UN Secretary General hands it over to the British or the Americans, Security Council meetings, it was meant to be weighty when the U.S. was talking, or the British ambassador, as the sort of, leading the international community, as it were. And now it seems it's getting more hollow. It's probably because a lot of the lies that have been told on that floor in the UN over the recent years, last 20 or 30 years, are getting particularly egregious. But there's definitely, I don't see the respect or the reverence or even the fear, Peter, that we've seen in the past, holding certain powers in high regard, Is that a good thing? Is this a dangerous thing? What might be coming in the near term here?
Well, we're seeing some major changes in the information battle space, and it is a battle space. That you've got on the one hand, the military battle space, then you've got the economic battle space, sanctions and all that. And then equally important, you have the information battle space where all the heavy weaponry is on the side of the Anglosphere. Virtual control of most of the mass media, the mainstream media, major control of the internet. But on the other side, you have a bunch of people, such as yourselves, conducting asymmetric warfare and making major gains. So we're beginning to see some holes in the Western narrative, and the global South is not letting itself be so easily manipulated, because they are beginning to get glimmerings of understanding of the true situation from alternative media and alternative sources of information. But let's not kid ourselves. We're still losing in the information battle space. That's where the Anglosphere is really still calling the shots.
Yeah, I'm going to say that the truth is losing in the information space, and I go back to the Britain banning RT. Basically forbidding the URL with internet service providers in Britain. I'm sitting in America right now, Peter. I'm in the United States, and I can access RT. They haven't banned RT in America. So the U.S. is not threatened by it. They're not threatened by the information as much as the UK is. And I know Liz Truss championed that ban of RT, plus sanctioning their journalists and all this before she was prime minister, when she was head of the Foreign Office. And you've got some experience with that side of things, and certainly in the Foreign Affairs Department. That's been your career as a career diplomat, working for Her Majesty's government. And this is unprecedented. This is the first time, I think, that they've blocked, whole websites and access to whole countries' information, especially RT. It's a fairly substantial media outlet. What did you make of that move? Because that's unprecedented. Britain's getting into the sanctions game now. And that used to be the U.S. had the sort of exclusivity on that arena. But what are your feelings on that whole issue?
Well, a couple of observations, Patrick. First of all, as you pointed out, RT hasn't been banned in the United States. And I would put this down to the fact that freedom of speech still counts for something stateside. It's enshrined in the First Amendment. You folks take freedom of speech quite seriously. We British don't. We pretend that we do, but we don't. And we've recently been through 2 years of experience with the COVID hysteria and lockdowns, when the government realized quite how easy it was to control freedom of speech. So they've learned some new habits, some new techniques, and they've not been afraid to apply them to this new situation with Ukraine. What's particularly alarming in the case of Britain is that we've copied the US with regard to economic sanctions on individuals. So now there are at least 2 British citizens who are subject to economic sanctions, meaning that effectively it's an economic death sentence. These are people who can't access their own money, can't open a new bank account, can't access the existing bank accounts cannot live, in other words, reduced literally to becoming beggars. And they're not even accused of breaking any law. They've just had the wrong opinion, said the wrong thing about Syria or Ukraine. This is unbelievable. Unbelievable. That is where we are. That the state, the US or the UK, or I think anywhere in the EU, you say the wrong thing, your government can kill you financially. Things have really reached a dreadful pass.
It's meant to put a muzzle on what people are saying. Graham Phillips is the
I mean, these are people who haven't broken any law. They're not even accused of breaking any law, and still the state can effectively send a financial drone at them and kill them economically. What world are we living in?
Yeah, for Graham Phillips, the accusation is he was spreading Russian propaganda. He was a British videographer from Nottingham, independent journalist, been in the Donbass for years. I followed Graham Phillips's work since 2014. And so he's been sanctioned. And I didn't see anybody come out and defend him. Not really in the mainstream press. Almost like there was a victory lap, like this was some great achievement. So what is he saying, Peter, that's so threatening? If he's just a little videographer working on his own, how's that threatening to the British state? And the answer is that this is where we're at. They can't even tolerate a small voice, a guy with a video camera and not a lot of money who's just putting out YouTube videos. Like they literally can't even, they don't want to compete against those ideas, which aren't.
We're doing exactly the kind of thing that for years we've been accusing Russia of doing, of attacking individual citizens, of not allowing freedom of speech. I sincerely believe there is more freedom of speech in Moscow today about the Ukraine conflict than there is in London or Washington.
I think that's a fact. I think that's a factual statement, Peter, based on a number of things. I've seen people get shut down for showing up with a Russian flag to a Ukrainian march in the UK. The police intervened, and so said they're disturbing the peace or whatever. So it's so politically polarized right now. So you're not, this is not hyperbolic hysteria we're talking about here. This is actually happening. Let's continue this conversation on the other side. We're going to take a break here with TNT, Today's News Talk. I'm with Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're talking about Ukraine and beyond. How's this affecting Western society, politics, and civilization? Are we heading in the right direction, or are we heading in the wrong direction on this? We'll pick this thread up on the other side. Stick around. We'll be right back.
De-weaponizing weather with reality and perspective.
Over the upcoming week, we find very warm weather centered over Greenland, where it's cold naturally, so being very warm doesn't mean it's boiling away. Also northern Siberia, same kind of situation. And the western part of the United States and much of Antarctica is warmer than normal. In the meantime, we continue to have cooler than normal weather in much of southern and central Australia, eastern China, Southeast Asia, right back into India. Pakistan, which had a very cool, wet summer, is now warmer than normal. The real big cold shock for this time of the year is coming into the eastern part of the United States early next week. But typical of the weather, the way it balances out, all this is going to get flipped around. And many people in the United States that could have near record cold next week may have near record warmth the week after. That's the way the weather works, okay? This is weatherbell.com meteorologist Joe Bastardi for TNT Radio, asking you to enjoy the weather. It's the only weather you've got.
The Congo provides 60% of the world's cobalt. Children as young as 7 breathe in cobalt-laden dust so you can drive an electric vehicle. We mandate that the truth be told. Today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
All right, we're in the final segment of the second hour of this live broadcast. Thank you for coming along with us for the ride here on the Patrick Henningsen Show, live on TNT, today's News Talk. Thank you for rejoining us. We're joined by guest Peter Ford. He's a former British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. We're discussing Ukraine. And Peter, you can't avoid the economic impact of all this. And I think people are really feeling it in Europe in the most horrific way. And the people, in my opinion, who are getting hit the hardest on this, of course, as usual anyway, are the working class and the people who are the upwardly mobile working class who would like to move into the middle class bracket. All these people are being hit very, very hard by this, the costs and fuel, energy especially, and this is also pushing inflation up all over the place. We can ill afford these policies. Nobody seems to be, however, Peter, connecting the policy decisions of government, not yet anyway, to these ridiculous highway robbery type rates that are popping up all over the place, that are robbing people their purchasing power and putting pressure on governments to, for instance, increase taxes or do other, printing up money out of thin air and driving up inflation even more. What are your feelings on the whole economic reverberation from Ukraine and the policies that are being undertaken in reaction to it?
Well, I think in Europe, including the UK, we're suffering a lot more from the economic backwash than the US is. The US is suffering in a minor way compared with the way we have it here in terms of a sinking currency, therefore more expensive imports. Sheer access to supplies of energy are under threat in Britain and above all Germany and elsewhere in the EU. And I noticed this is picked up in opinion polls in the States compared with Europe. The Europeans are absolutely desperate over the economic situation and worried about the way the Ukraine conflict is impacting on that. Whereas in the States, from what I read, there is less awareness of how dangerous the Ukraine situation is and how it's affecting America. But a small example of what's going on. Just yesterday, Putin announced an offer to Europe of opening or partially opening one of the remaining links in the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The one of the pipelines that was sabotaged recently. Well, it can be partially reopened, and Putin was making an offer to Europe to supply Europe with gas. Now, our state broadcaster, the BBC, contrived to virtually ignore this very important piece of information, just about as important as a piece of information possibly could be in our situation today, access to cheap gas. But no, it's inconvenient because it gives the lie to the government's narrative that it's all Putin's fault. They contrive with media connivance to create the impression that it's Putin who's turning the gas taps off on Europe, whereas Russia would like nothing more than to be able to supply more gas. It's us who have applied sanctions to Russia. Our suffering is self-inflicted, and it's us who provoked Russia into starting what they call the special military operation. All our suffering is self-inflicted. We failed to anticipate that we might have problems of supply in due course. We gave priority to saving energy rather than securing new energy supplies. We've made mistake after mistake, but it's so convenient to blame Putin, and the media just go along with that.
And how sustainable is this, Peter? We're going to be coming up to, it won't be long now. We'll be coming up to a year that this whole state of affairs has been going on here, coming up to February, let's say, 2023. I hope nothing serious happens in the interim of that. Of course, there's always that possibility. We seem to be, staring out in the abyss of a thermonuclear war or some kind of escalated NATO conflict with Russia. But, how long can they keep this gag going, this scapegoating Putin, when it'll become more apparent, especially in Europe, Peter? Germany's under tremendous economic pressure, as is France. Okay, that's the core of the European Union right there. And, half of the UN Security Council almost. How long can they keep this charade going? Because the sums just don't add up. And at some point, something on the narrative here has to break. Do you think it could break on the streets of France, for instance? What are your feelings on this?
Well, I don't think the narrative will break, but I do think there'll be trouble. There'll be some broken windows before we get through this winter. People will. What's happening in the UK is simply that people are demanding that the government give them more money. They're not interested really in causes, whether it was the self-inflicted cost of lockdown, whether it was the self-inflicted cost of approaching net zero unrealistically, or whether it was us getting embroiled in a war in Eastern Europe. At the end of the day, they just want more government money. And this is what the government are doing. In the case of the British government, we printed money to buy people off discontent through the lockdowns. We paid people to sit on their backsides for months on end. We paid businesses to close themselves down. And there's still not much questioning of whether all that was wise. But people are demonstrating. I witnessed a demonstration recently here in Liverpool about the cost of living. And all that the campaigners were asking for was more government money, more printing. They've seen that the government has found the so-called magic money tree, which previously only Corbyn had access to. They've seen that the government can print more money, and that is their rallying cry, not stop causing more and more problems with these stupid actions on the COVID, on climate, and on Ukraine. So I'm pessimistic that the narrative will be meaningfully breached. Nevertheless, there will be trouble in the streets.
Trouble in the streets, that's an understatement, possibly. But Peter, in past years, and you've observed politics over the decades, was there a higher level of economic literacy, at least on the public punditry or the media political conversation, that if you just printed up an unlimited amount of money and paid people not to work, paid businesses not to trade, that might have some kind of horrible ramifications in terms of inflation, for instance? I don't see anybody acknowledging this today. Was this different before? Did people know this before?
No. Well, it's never been this bad before. We've never reached a stage where the government effectively took a sledgehammer to the country's economy and systematically tried to destroy it for a period of almost 2 years. We have never witnessed anything like that. And maybe during the Second World War, when the economy had to be reoriented to produce more armaments, but that was understandable. And even then, it didn't do as much damage as we have been doing. Now we had the stupidity of the banks getting over lent in the lead up to the 2008 banking crisis, but we've never had anything quite so literally suicidal as the COVID nonsense and the actions on climate, which have helped to precipitate the crisis and make sure that it was focused on the area, our Achilles heel of energy prices, which affect everything else. And now we have the happenstance of the Ukraine conflict. We've got, I hate to use an overworked term, but we've got the perfect storm now.
So really, and I've said this in a recent article, which I've written for New Dawn magazine in Australia, that all of this has created the war effect. So we've got the war effect, i.e., the economy that's broken and needs to be rebuilt, but without the actual shooting war on European soil, for instance, or British soil.
Well, what we did have a war. It was a war of the government against the people.
Yes, correct.
The government took a sledgehammer to people's businesses, particularly small businesses. Big business, a lot of it prospered. But the ordinary people, small businesses, were attacked by their own government.
Which has never happened before. That's pretty unprecedented, isn't it?
Absolutely. I can't think of a precedent any time in history. And the madness goes on. It's poorer people now who are bearing the brunt of the energy crisis. Government are giving handouts which will alleviate slightly the poverty. But the situation in Britain over the winter is going to be absolutely dire for the poor. For the poor and medium earners, and then there are all the secondary effects because of sterling tanking. All imports are more expensive. Interest rates, sterling tanking. All imports are more expensive. Interest rates are having to rise. Government spending on welfare is going to have to be cut. All of this is going to impact more on poorer people and the blue-collar workers.
It's also, you're probably going to see an increase in crime, usually corresponds to these sort of things.
Already happening.
So, and then the government's response to that, I know how the British government can respond to that. They're going to say, we need to be tough on crime, and, they'll, increase sentences and all this. Again, Peter, this is back to what you said before, not addressing the causes of the crisis, not dealing with the causes of these trends, just dealing with the top end. It's funny, the government is like the medical industrial complex, or attacking it the same way, not dealing with the causes and just the symptoms, treating the symptoms. Sadly. But so Peter, before we wrap up, and I really appreciate your time joining us this week, going into the winter, back to Ukraine, a lot of people are saying that the U.S. and a lot of this commotion, a lot of this is geared towards the U.S. midterm elections. The Biden administration, the Democrats, need to rescue something out of this Ukraine issue that's becoming increasingly unpopular. And when the winter comes, that things are not going to look good for Kiev. Is Russia more in its element, prosecuting a winter military operation than a summer one?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that this side of the midterms, nothing much is going to happen in the U.S. political world. Even if Biden wanted to scale back the conflict, I don't think politically he could. Will he try to do so after the midterms? Well, I don't wish to be complacent, or over pessimistic. But no, I think the outlook is for this frozen conflict. Things will just go on and on. We'll continue to dig ourselves into a bigger and bigger hole. And things will just get worse and stabilize at a really bad level, economically, politically, informationally.
Totally unavoidable. I mean, totally avoidable. Pardon me. Totally avoidable, Peter. From a policy point of view, I just don't buy this, that this is inevitable. People are talking about this like it's, a natural situation. It's just a reaction to a despot in Moscow, and that we need to frame everything around that. It's completely, in my mind, avoidable if some reversals took place on certain policies right across the board, the green policies, the Russia sanctions, and so forth. A lot of this stuff would just alleviate the problems immediately. So the question is, Peter, when are the people going to wake up to that?
No, I'm afraid that all the political elites, not just the top political leadership, but all the political elites in the EU, the UK, the US, are so heavily invested in these narratives about the conflict, about energy, about hygiene. They can't back down, even if they wanted to, which they don't, because they prospered because of these narratives. It's just going to go on and on. The politicians are basically just the puppets of these narratives, which have been created by the elites.
Oh, and they're just going to double down on them, Peter. They're just going to double down. That's what you do when you got a bad hand. You double down. We double down. Thank you, Peter Ford, British ambassador to Syria and Bahrain. Appreciate your time this week.
You're welcome, Patrick, anytime.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That's Peter Ford. Look, we're going to take a break here. Top of the hour news headlines. French journalist Preti Ponton on the other side. What's happening in the EU? Well, we'll find out. We'll get to the bottom of it. Stick around. We'll be right back.